Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Zoom lecture hosted by the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society. And it's my great privilege to chair this lecture. My name's Sarah Pearce, and I'm the chair of the Society. And so, to introduce our lecturers, Paul Collins is Keeper of the Middle East Department at the British Museum. He was previously Professor of Ancient Middle East and Jaleh Hearn Curator in the Department of Antiquities at the Ashmolean Museum at the University of Oxford. And he is currently Chair of the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. Paul is a co-investigator on the Nahrain Network project, which researches sustainable development of Iraqi history and heritage, funded by the AHRC Global Challenges Fund. Paul's research interests include the role of visual representation in the origins of the state and kingship in Mesopotamia, the meaning of Assyrian imagery, the history of collecting, and the role of museum displays in shaping our knowledge about disciplines. And these interests are reflected in his many publications, which include The Sumerians' Lost Civilizations, From Egypt to Babylon, the International Age from 1500 to 500 BC, Assyrian Palace Sculptures, and the Uruk phenomenon, which deals with 4th millennium BCE Mesopotamia. Our other lecturer, Hindy Najman, is Oriel and Lang Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture at Oriel College, the University of Oxford, position which she took up in 2015, having previously held the post of Professor of Religious Studies and Classics at Yale University. Hindy is also the director and founder of the Center for the Study of the Bible at Oriel College. Hindy's research interests range widely in the broad field of the study of biblical interpretation and ancient Judaism and Christianity, including approaches rooted in philosophy, philology, and literary studies. Hindy's currently working on a project called Ethical Reading, the Transformation of Text and Self, and has also published recently on this. This project considers the ethical implications of ancient reading and writing practices, and also of our contemporary ways of reading and writing about ancient texts. Hindy's publications are very many, and just to name a very few of the fundamental contributions that she's made, most recently with George Brooke, an edited volume which is very relevant to today's topic on materiality and textuality, published last year, and also a number of key monographs, Losing the Temple and Recovering the Future, an analysis of 4 Ezra, Past Renewals, Interpretative Authority, Renewed Revelation, and the Quest for Perfection, and Seconding Sinai, the development of Mosaic discourse in Second Temple Judaism. And forthcoming, again, very relevant to today, is her Reading Practices and the Vitality of Scripture, to be published by Oxford University Press. So today we welcome Hindy and Paul to speak on their joint project, a collaboration between the British Museum and Oriel College, which began in 2017, I believe. And we're here also to celebrate all that they have achieved so far as they develop this work, in the hope that it will turn from concept into a great exhibition. And it's our great privilege to be invited into their work and their world of the work in progress. This project is partly inspired by their shared work on materiality and textuality, and from the perspective of the study of the Bible by Hindy's work on scriptural vitality, the subject of her new book, on how Judaism expresses itself across cultural divides, and on Judaism in conversation with other religious traditions, a vital contribution to today's environment. So if I may hand over to you, thank you very much, Paul and Hindy.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. It's thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And it's an enormous pleasure. Both Hindy and I are very excited to be invited to offer this talk this evening, and really to, as you explained, introduce you to some of our thinking over the past 6 or 7 years. It's been an enormous pleasure for me working with Hindy when I was in Oxford, and we were able to maintain that momentum when I moved to London and the British Museum. So what we're going to lay out here are some of our thinking and thoughts around moving towards what we hope will be indeed a major exhibition. And just move the slides on, and we'll give you a sense of how we've broken down the talk today. We'll take it in turns just to focus in really very much on our own areas of specialism and how they intersect and come together to, as I say, hope we'll be able to produce something innovative and exciting, intended very much, of course, ultimately for the world at large, a popular audience, an audience that perhaps won't have encountered many of the ideas that we'll be exploring today. So I'll start the talk exploring the exhibition vision. We are supported, I have to say, by a dream team of colleagues, I think we can call it. There you can see Hindy at the top of the chart, but if we call it a scientific committee or an advisory board, but we've benefited enormously from the contribution of our colleagues on the screen here, and they have formed a core part of moving this project forward. So we're very grateful indeed to them. For myself, of course, I come, as Sarah explained, not from the world of studying ancient Judaism or Jewish history, but rather instead from the museum world. I'm a curator by training, but with interest very much in the wider Middle East, particularly focused on Mesopotamia. So what I bring to the mix, I hope, is a real interest in text and image, and there we find parallel strands of interest. So I show you here, of course, not material from the world of Israel, but from the world of Mesopotamia, and some of the earliest representations of text and image together. And it is very much that intersection that intrigues me, and I've been exploring at length that relationship as far as the Mesopotamian world is concerned, but one thinks about it more generally across the broader Middle East. And how, from my perspective, imagery represents ritual, whereas the text represents legal statements of historic reality. And it is that mixing of those two elements which I think are very useful to bring into the conversations, as we will explore a little later. My main focus has been on the great reliefs of the Assyrian Empire, this particular example, of course, coming from the site of Kalhu, modern Nimrud. And again, that emphasis very much on the visual images, in this case of kingship, but with the intersection of text, the so-called standard inscription on these reliefs, which give the information about the individuals depicted, but the individuals are depicted in an abstract form. And again, it's that intersection between the legal statement of the text and the visual image of the visual representation. That's intriguing to me. So hold on to that thought from my perspective. But what I want to take you now into the other area of the world, of course, that I'm particularly interested in, which is the curatorial aspect, presenting to the world some of this thinking. And in that, I'm thinking about the spaces that this material occupied. So here in the reconstruction of the Assyrian throne room, and the ritualized activities that took place within them. Again, it's that intersection between the reality of the world, the liminal spaces that they created, and the connections with the supernatural world beyond they enabled. And that, of course, then brings us into the gallery spaces of a museum. And I show you here some images from the Great British Museum exhibition. I think it was a great exhibition at the British Museum. I am Ashurbanipal, King of the World, King of Assyria. Again, we evoked spaces through the material culture, again, thought about that intersection with text, using modern techniques like projection onto the reliefs. So you see not only a reconstruction of color, but also the narratives explained in languages that a modern visitor to these spaces can appreciate and can gain access to these highly complex images. So again, these are some of the themes and ideas that we will be thinking about as we move towards our future exhibition. And that includes what's often been described in the past as sort of immersive experiences, where we can create sensory engagement with spaces which are so often missing from museum displays, from exhibition displays, which are absolutely fundamental, of course, for thinking about the engagement between text, image, and people. And so again, these are key themes that we want to wrap together in the future exhibition. Well, what does that exhibition look like? Well, I want to lay out here the historical framework that we've decided to peg, as it were, the intellectual thoughts upon. It will be a framework which will be immensely familiar to the vast majority of the audience here today. I see very distinguished historians in the audience, so my apologies for this very rapid run through of what will be very familiar world, I'm sure. But I want to highlight where we want, as it were, to focus. So the historical narrative is one thread, but it's really an opportunity from which we will then explore some of those more complex interactions between time, space, imagery, and text. And we'll begin in our mind, in the galleries, with what might be described as the background, but the first millennium context out of which our narrative will emerge. And it's really there to set the geographical and historical scene for our visitors, the non-specialist, but also to think about the convergence of ideas across the Middle East, the sorts of questions I'm asking about text and image, and how those are not isolated phenomenon, but part of a broader intersection between the Mesopotamian world and the Mediterranean world. So we'll set the background and then focus in, of course, on the emerging kingdoms of Israel and specifically of Judah, and think about again those moments within that early period, which is so important for defining identities and ideas in later periods. So of course we will explore the Babylonian Empire, the attacks by Nebuchadnezzar II, the Lachish letter here, referencing that attack around 586 BC, when of course a large part of the population of Judah is taken into exile, deported, and Jerusalem plundered. But referencing again the local phenomenon, such as revealed by things like the Ketef Hinnom scrolls of literacy, and references to language that's already very close to what will become familiar from the Hebrew Bible. So again, setting very much the scene for our visitors. Of course, here I just use this image to evoke that notion of thousands of people being forced away from Jerusalem, but of course taken to other parts of the Middle East, either forcibly to the Mesopotamian world, or, as we'll carry the story through and expand it in the galleries, to places like Elephantine Island, down in southern Egypt, where, of course, communities of Hebrew speakers begin to express some of the earliest references to Jewish identity and faith and ritual. And so we'll draw on, we hope, some of the key documents of this period, from the Cyrus cylinder launching the Persian period, and again this idea of the Babylonian return to Jerusalem, but also the relationships in Egypt between, as it were, the local communities and their faiths, and the temple that is built in this small community. And it's really a focus on the people that is a recurring theme we want to emphasize throughout this exhibition. It's to enable our visitors to engage directly with people and not just abstract ideas of faith and identity. And of course, that will then take us in, as we build the momentum, growing areas within the exhibition space, to key moments when we see the emergence of Jerusalem as a center of ritual and pilgrimage, attacks by the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, the plundering of the temple there, and then the emergence of the Hasmonean dynasty. So again, drawing on the archaeological evidence to reveal that transformation and the first established Jewish kingdom through the archaeological record. And of course, it's as we enter the period from Alexander the Great into the Roman period, the Hellenistic period, this becomes a key point in the exhibition for reflection. The moment when we start to see the, as it were, the unforced convergence between the Greek and Jewish culture, and all the exciting thinking and vitality as expressed through things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, most famously, of course. But of course, for our visitors, again, they will be taken on that historical journey into this period when we see of course, Pompey's legions taking the province of Judea becomes a tributary province under the Roman authority, and the beneficiaries are Herod's family. And we see Jerusalem again transformed into this extraordinary center. And so again, something for our visitors to recognize, an extraordinary moment, turning point in time, and then the intellectual world that emerges out of that. And here, and you'll see this image several times in this talk, the Magdala stone, perhaps an eyewitness, as it were, account visually of the great temple at the heart of Jerusalem, Herod's temple, with the earliest depiction of the menorah. And this allows us to set up again the sense of place and identity through architecture and image, as much as through text. And of course, we then face that other great defining moment, the destruction of Jerusalem and the plundering of the temple under Vespasian and Titus. So by 70 AD, again, we can hear a 19th century vision of it, but we will do something equally thrilling for a modern audience in the exhibition space. And perhaps we hope be able to evoke this extraordinary tragedy and defining moment through a life-size replica of part of the Arch of Titus. We don't have space for the entire arch, but there is a completely detailed scan and replica of that famous scene of the menorah being paraded through Rome in Yeshiva University Museum, and we hope to either borrow that or develop our own version of it. So again, a marker in the exhibition where our visitors might essentially feel they're walking under the arch and seeing this moment. But we'll draw, of course, very much on other material from this period, such as the gold coins that were struck as a result of the plundering of the temple. The gold almost certainly coming out of the temple hoard. This particular example in the Ashmolean Museum will lead our visitors then, of course, into that other great defining moment under Hadrian, the rebellion under Ben-Kokhba, Bar Kokhba rebellion in the 130s, and that moment again when Jerusalem and the temple specifically is leveled, and the Jews are essentially barred from the holy city. And that sets us up to look beyond Jerusalem and begin that exploration around vitality through both text and images. So we'll be drawing, for example, on the remarkable wall paintings from places like Dura Europos, the originals in Damascus. So it's not going to be possible to borrow those. But from Yale University, for example, we have ceiling tiles, but also copies of the paintings that were made at the time of excavation. So actually the colors in these copies are closer to the time of excavation than the actual paintings themselves now. So drawing on those, we begin to think about the rebuilding of Jerusalem in memory and through text and image, and the relationship of that memory to a past that is made present through the synagogue. And we move from wall paintings to what I suspect may well be one of the most exciting parts of the exhibition, where we can borrow mosaics. We will do so. And just as an example, of course, there's conversations yet to happen, but the great mosaics that have been covered at Bukok, showing these extraordinary images, biblical scenes. Here, Jonah being swallowed by a fish, that is in turn swallowed by another fish and swallowed by another fish. So hugely exciting visual dynamic images, which bring, of course, these scenes to life and reality and presence. And the image that introduced this talk shows this extraordinary image of the encounter between leaders, deeply different interpretations of what's going on here. Certainly, it seems to be the high priest meeting a figure in Greek dress, perhaps Alexander the Great or a Seleucid leader, but it's an historical encounter depicted on a synagogue floor. So it's unique in that sense. So again, all sorts of interesting ways to engage with the idea of the past, but also the present. And of course, there's also the sense of that vitality and dynamic thinking in more local imagery produced for ordinary houses, as it were, outside of the communal spaces. And so we'll look at Mesopotamian magic bowls as a way of thinking about the really extraordinary dynamic world of demons, magicians, and intellectual thinking that's embedded in these extraordinary objects. So again, weaving together all these threads to paint a picture of a world that is not static and at all, but very dynamic in its thinking. And that brings us towards the conclusion of this sort of historical narrative as we defined it, keeping it tight so that we can raise all these issues, but without it becoming overwhelming. So we'll close the exhibition historically in the 7th century of the Common Era, that moment when we can explore that convergence, another convergence, which results in the people of the book, so Christianity and Islam drawing, of course, on this rich tradition of Judaism and continuing those conversations and engagement. And perhaps, again, much to be decided, but perhaps one way that our visitors can leave the exhibition is to reflect on the fact that, of course, it doesn't stop in the 7th century. Those conversations, that thinking, that dynamism continues through to the now, and we might use, for example, the examples from the Cairo Geniza from the 5th century through to the 19th century to show, again, continuity of engagement and thinking with all these ideas. So that's the vision. I will now hand you over to Hindy, who will take you through some of the intellectual challenges that we hope to engage with in the show.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for that inspiring vision that you've shared with us for the exhibition. The exhibition, which Paul Collins just walked you through, comes out of nearly a decade of thinking and working on the way in which discoveries across nearly a century have transformed the way we as historians, curators, and interpreters understand antiquity, understand Judaism in its variegated and complex interrelatedness with cultures across time, and the vital and dynamic ways in which Judaism emerged, not as dead or late in the Persian and Hellenistic periods, but rather as ever emerging in intimate conversation with surrounding cultures. This project is part of the British Museum's investment in new research and findings that transform the way we think about ancient culture. And it was also inspired physically as an installation by the I Am Ashurbanipal exhibition. And if we're able to launch this, the hope is to share it in that same large space on the main floor of the museum. Our exhibition is also in collaboration, as Paul mentioned, with my new Oxford monograph entitled Scriptural Vitality, which will appear in December 2024. And in that book, I rethink implications for hermeneutics and philology. Building on that research and in collaboration with Paul Collins and the team in the British Museum, the exhibition will broaden the ambition for rethinking vitality, but now for archaeology and art history across many centuries in the study of Judaism. This could only be possible with Oxford, in particular Oriel College and the provost, Lord Neil Mendoza, but also faculties of theology and religion, classics, and ancient and Middle Eastern studies are all represented here in our Zoom community today. So we want to express our appreciation for your support, along with the extraordinary and determined British Museum partnership. Also the Centers of Hebrew and Jewish Studies, as well as the Center for the Study of the Bible in Oriel. It takes a large community to build something like this, and we are excited to build with you, with our students, with our community, and with this partnership. While we know that the findings are transformative, the integration into scholarship and into the way in which we tell the story of Judaism has not yet really been integrated. These new contexts for, and we could go to the next slide, these new contexts for rethinking and rereading a Judaism, which was retrospectively reconstructed from late sources, enables us now to perceive a vitality which was not previously understood. And there are three expressions on your slide. One is the Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran, as well as the Cairo Geniza, so textual expressions, the Magdala stone, which was just mentioned, as well as mosaics from Hukok, Wadi Hammam, En Gedi, and Hamat Tavaria. One example, the Isaiah scroll, exhibits the history and the layering of scribal correction, performance, and rethinking of the textual tradition. We will engage the Shrine of the Book in their collections at the Israel Museum, and also the exemplary new research of the Israel Antiquities Authorities on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Marcello Fidanzio, who's here today, and the new findings embedded within the Isaianic scroll, as well as Mladen Popovich's advancements from his ERC, The Hands That Wrote the Bible. Our goal is to bring to the public and the academic audiences, young and old, lay audience, and specialized students and teachers, to new insights that dynamically transform our understanding of the past from 2nd millennium BCE, even until the present. This is from Pesher Habakkuk, another remarkable text from the Dead Sea Scrolls, our earliest Jewish commentary. We know this from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's provided us with a great deal of information about what reading and textuality and commentary is in the Hellenistic period. And we will have many such texts, but I want to give you a taste of the kind of work we'll do and how we're performing vitality in this exhibition. Pesher Habakkuk shows us how texts were being read and interpreted self-consciously. It's our earliest interpretation of the prophet Habakkuk, both by the form and the content of the scroll. And George Brooke is here today, and he's done some seminal work on the way in which we can see scribes thinking through their writing and the separation of the lemma and their own explanation. We can perceive the interpretation emerging. Pesher Habakkuk shows us how scribes and scholars understood themselves to be inspired as prophets in the work of interpretation and updating and activating texts from centuries before. Pesher Habakkuk has also provided us with a great deal of insight into the state of biblical texts. This is also true for the findings of the Dead Sea Scrolls more generally. But in our specific case, the text of Habakkuk is not fixed or static, but we come to understand that while books such as Habakkuk have an identity, there are still fluidity and changes within the text. There's even fluidity within shared linguistic registers and across a whole host of languages into which these texts are being translated, like Greek and Aramaic. But it's not only biblical scrolls, but also scrolls like Pesher Habakkuk, where we come to have access to our earliest fragments of biblical texts in Hebrew and Aramaic from the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. Prior to the findings of the scrolls, we had references to Israel or Judah in inscriptions. We had early expressions of what we come to know, biblical traditions like the priestly blessing in the Ketef Hinnom amulet, which Paul already mentioned, or the Balaam cycle in the Der Allah inscription, but not scrolls and certainly not entire works such as Isaiah or Genesis. Let me move quickly now, and we'll come back again to the Magdala stone, but I want to make a few comments about the Magdala stone and about mosaics. The Magdala stone, discovered in a synagogue from the 1st century, especially through the research of Rina Talgam, who joins us today and is a very seminal voice in our project. Rina has argued that it really transforms the way we think about worship, prayer, and the intimate relationship between the temple and the synagogue, the Beit Knesset, even during the period of the Second Temple period. And of course, beyond. This object is engraved with symbols and assisted in Torah reading. This is developed in her forthcoming monograph, which will be published this coming year. But it is located within a synagogue itself, demonstrating that artistic representation, iconic representation in a space of prayer was part of the synagogue life itself, and it built a bridge between sacrificial worship and liturgical worship. We have descriptions of Second Temple synagogues and places of worship, but we haven't found objects like this, which really redefine and challenge us to understand the aesthetic in the synagogue. And this brings me to the next slide, 37 and forward. In late antiquity, this is from Engedi, we come to see mosaics which continue the tradition of aesthetics in places of prayer and study. Here also is the text and image about which Paul spoke in our first section, calling upon this relationship between text and image. And one thing that also drew myself and Paul together is our affection for and love for Irene Winter's field-defining work about text and image 2,000 years prior and even earlier. We come to see the role of the mosaic as a way of thinking about a context which integrates the thought and beliefs of Judaism and textual traditions alongside the cultural context of the Greco-Roman world. And here I invoke one of our team members, Yash Elsner, and his work on ekphrasis. Problematizing the search for the original is part of the work of the exhibition. And here this exhibition problematizes an existing narrative which fundamentally undermines a growing and vibrant Judaism. The narrative of Spät Judentum, or late Judaism, gives rise to an account of replacement of Judaism with other religious traditions. If we resist the call to privilege earlier or the original or the first, and instead come to appreciate that religious traditions in all of their various iterations and in their various cultural context and chronological periods, we can come with a kind of integrity to integrate the new findings and better understand the way in which Judaism emerged and survived. Part of what we want to do is appreciate the Babylonian period, the Persian period, the Hellenistic period, late antiquity. And we also want to understand origins and resilience as part of the title, but also part of our understanding of the growth and the challenges that Judaism experienced. Returning a moment then, to the Isaiah scroll and its creative and layered scribal engagements across generations of readers and interpretive communities, as well as another scroll. This is Jeremiah. I want you to look carefully at the correction and scribal markings all around this text. Iber Tichler has discussed and shown in great detail the hands of the scribes that correct and refine our textual traditions from the Hellenistic period and literally bring these texts to life. It's a kind of performance which in order to read, in order to write, in order to describe, that the scribes and the interpretive communities were participating in, which leads us to the way in which these interpretive communities worked in between the texts and their ritual performances. 14 mikvaot are discovered at the site of Qumran alone, a site consumed with purity, tahara, with prayer, with worship, and with study. There's ongoing ritual activity. And this is from the tefillin that are found, preparing the pathway for later fixed prayer, which has been discussed by Heinemann, by Esther Chazon, and more recently by Arjen Bakker, but also signaling variation and transformation. That is, the traditions of tefillin that are found at Qumran are not identical to the traditions we find later in the history of Judaism. What we observe at Qumran and throughout Jewish antiquity is a dynamic and variation that we want to thematize. So on the one hand, there's loss and tragedy about which Paul just spoke. On the other hand, there's a vitality and resilience. And I think this contrast of the scrolls and mosaics in a number of different iterations alongside the Arch of Titus is meant to capture this tension throughout the history of the religious tradition. Piyut, Jewish liturgical prayer, here is where we will engage, especially the Kairogeniza, these liturgical poems, which really helps us see and understand the way in which Jewish poetry continued from the Psalms and from Isaiah all the way through the history of Israel and Judah and the history of Judaism. So instead of thinking about Hebrew as becoming an artificial or frozen language, as people have argued, Jeffrey Kahn in particular has talked about vernacular and non-vernacular performance with respect to Hebrew text and Hebrew poetry from the Hellenistic period all the way through the medieval period. We see new developments of poetics, aesthetics, and philology, all embedded in surrounding culture and literary developments, but also with a distinctive inheritance of a hermeneutical and interpretive, as well as a textual past of performance and reading. A few more words about the magic bowls before I turn it back over to Paul again. Here we see magic bowls, which are full of reading, prayer, angels, demons, calling for protection against danger. And it's also a call for life, integrating established prayer with remarkable, creative, and even desperate calls for ongoing angelic and divine protection. Prayers, amulets, magic bowls. This is a particular engagement with one of our team members, Gideon Bohak, along with a whole host of scholars, some of whom are here today: Dora Tamolin, Adi Wiener, Avigail Manikin, Rifki Elitzur, and Daniel Waller. Okay, on to you, Paul. Okay. Paul, I think you might be muted.
Thank you very much. Classic mistake. I want to just bring very briefly back to some of the themes you've touched on there, Hindy, around time and space, coming back to some of the thoughts I offered up front, particularly within an exhibition setting. So I just take you back into the Mesopotamian world with this extraordinary image from the reign of Ashurbanipal around the middle of the 7th century BC, where the documentation is of an historical event, but it's depicted in such a way that it fuses ancient myth with that historical moment. And again, thinking about this more broadly, how that then helps us to think about some of the imagery we see in the synagogue paintings and mosaics and the descriptions in the texts. In this particular example, it's the Epic of Gilgamesh that's fused with this 650 monument. But that allows us then, of course, to reflect very much on the use of the stories from the Hebrew Bible and how they are evoking, yes, a past, but also reflecting a present and a future. So it's about bringing time together. And of course, they decorate, they are part of physical spaces. So we need to be thinking about that in the exhibition, allowing our visitors to move into those spaces, to be thinking about that engagement with the visual, and of course, the words that they're hearing within those spaces and the other ritual activities involved. And that, of course, inevitably brings us back to that point that Hindy raised around the Magdala stone and that extraordinary relationship between ritual, visual, and space itself. So back to you, Hindy.
Thank you. So one of the central ways in which exhibitions are run are around star objects. We have many from our wish list, but we thought that we might return and deepen our presentation today by highlighting why we've chosen 2 of the star objects for you today. One of them is the Magdala stone, and we're each going to say a little bit about these 2 star objects, starting with the Magdala stone, and we even have an image here. You can see the engravings here and the location within the synagogue in the very central place. And we have a picture of Rena standing with it, who's here as well, but she's teaching this stone. And we're all very excited, Rena, for your book, which is coming imminently. I want to say 3 things. One is to find an engraved object within a synagogue while the temple is standing. Second, to understand and to study these images. And third, to put these objects in conversation with text to understand how the Jewish tradition is growing and changing in its own cultural context, but also as it inherits and integrates a tradition of temple in new contexts like synagogue and study houses.
I come to it, of course, very much as the curator who's intrigued, excited by the possibility of displaying this extraordinary object in a context which makes it more meaningful than perhaps it has previously had in terms of temporary exhibitions, and that opportunity to engage the imagery with that broader space and think about the relationship of people to it.
Thank you. And to say just a little bit about the mosaics, this is from Hamat Tveria, and we have a few other images that we've taken that we'll share with you as we speak now. To say just a few brief comments. Number one is, on the one hand, that's the challenge to aniconism, to the idea that in a synagogue you don't have images, and we do. We have many synagogues with the most beautiful images, some of which strike us as Greek and Roman, others which strike us as Babylonian, others which strike us as very particularly Jewish. This is true of the inscriptions, of the images, and the extraordinary work that had to be done in order to install this in synagogues. We often have names of the people that paid for these beautiful mosaics from the community. We understand this as a bridge between prayer and sacrifice. And this is actually exhibited in some of the, and here you see the menorah, there are incense shovels, there are signs of sacrifice long after sacrifice. So to hold the place of sacrifice both in prayer and in study and in the visionary, in the way in which people see and live and experience Judaism is part of its own transformation. So to read the Piyutim, for example, the liturgical poems, which memorialize activities in the temple alongside the mosaics, and also to appreciate in a museum the beautiful aesthetic of Chukok, Hamat Tveria, and Wadi Hammam.
For me, again, thinking of our visitor who may be coming intrigued by the narrative, but also by the extraordinary art, I think it is really just to make that point, that abundant picturing in all sorts of forms, whether in physical form or through the text. It was part of Jewish expectations of how their places of gathering and worship would be. And I think if many people take that away, that would be a great accomplishment for this show.
And I think now we're each just going to offer a few closing remarks about the exhibition. For me, I think it's essential both for research and impact on society to teach the public about these new archaeological findings and why and how they matter. How to teach Judaism and Jewish tradition in context and across time, in conversation with the pagan world, with the Babylonian world, with Christianity and Islam. We understand Judaism there in this exhibition as a dynamic and ever-growing tradition in conversation with other traditions, peoples, and cultures. And one of the things that we didn't have a chance to talk about today is that we hope to also bring in sound in the context of this exhibition and the work that Jeffrey Kahn has done on Kurdish and Iraqi Jewish communities, some of the oldest performances of liturgy and text, to hear and to see how the community performed and experienced and copied and transmitted their traditions. Entanglement, I'll say a word about entanglement as an important concept, I think. We want to view this vitality of which we spoke as growing out of a broader cultural synergy in the Greco-Roman world and later periods, and the entanglement of cultural traditions. But this is articulated in a distinctively Jewish way through liturgy and seeing, how one sees and how one prays. We see a deep entanglement between the creation of new compositions and objects and the reimagining of older existing ones. So readers and communities create new objects, new texts, and new conditions for earlier traditions, for them to survive, but now in new contexts. And this is innovative with respect to language, culture, and at times even theological or philosophical implications. And our hope is that our new community, that is the interpretive community that experiences this exhibit, will also contribute to that vitality.
And again, I come back to that recurring theme about opportunities for people to engage with these ideas in a sensory way, so that they can experience perhaps walking into the synagogue at Hokuk, walking over the mosaics, not the ancient ones, but we'll offer alternative versions, hearing the sounds, the words, thinking about the smells, the lived experience of this as a way of beginning to understand these very complex, dynamic, vital developments in the past. And that, from a curatorial perspective, is a very exciting challenge. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Hindy and Paul, for a really wonderful tour de force there. I can't wait for the exhibition. Question. Someone has, Laura Resnikoff, you've raised your hand. You have a question?
Yes, if I may. Laura Resnikoff from New York City. I'd be very interested to hear your remarks about the nexus between what you spoke about and the actual physical land I don't want to use words, so I'm just going to say the physical land, outside of the physicality of the mosaics, but the physical land over these periods. Thank you.
Shall I start, Hindy? I don't know whether you're...
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, very good. Yes, I think that's very important. Again, going back to where I started thinking about that broader Middle East, and the engagement, of course, not just within a restricted area, but these the idea of transmission and convergence of ideas, that is tied very closely, of course, to the broader landscape, first the physical landscape, but also the intellectual and religious landscape. So for sure, that will need to be expressed within the exhibition. So it isn't just about walls and enclosed spaces, but very much a lived experience for communities as a whole.
Could you say a little bit more about the Magdala stone as such a key element?
Yeah, I was wondering, Sarah, I was wondering if we might invite Rina to say something, because Rina Talgam is with us. And
Lovely, yes.
I hope that's not, but Rina, if you might respond to the way in which Paul have presented the research, both that you've done, as well as the implications of including the project in our exhibition.
I prefer not to refer. You've done a remarkable job in the way you presented this.
I think it's the equivalent of Alan Grossman saying the author is not present. Well, I mean, I can say something about Rina's work, which is just the way in which Rina has opened up the object was very seminal for the very first discussions about the exhibition. Sarah, if this is responding to your question. A few people have asked when. We're hoping for the autumn of 2028, and it just does take that long in order to enable such an exhibition. And Paul can speak to that more in a moment. But I think the most important thing to say about this stone, and Rina, please correct us if we're overstating or understating the implications. It's a game changer for how we understand prayer and object in ancient synagogues, and really a building bridge between synagogues and temple worship, which was always understated in rabbinic literature and in early Christian literature, and overstated, if you will, in liturgy and in study, which is constantly talking about rules and practices connected to temple. But we see that this is also a very central part of ritual and performance, which was carried through the articulation of Judaism centuries after the temple was destroyed. So I hope that responds, Sarah. I don't know, Paul, do you want to say a bit about the timing? I think there are a few questions in the chat about that.
Yes, there are.
Yes, as you said, Hindy, these things take a while to develop. And we obviously need to have conversations around loans, and then think about design and the bringing of objects to the museum. But yes, at the moment, the schedule for exhibitions offers a possibility of 2028. So that's really where our thinking is at the moment. It's a complex juggling job, because we have lots of other activities in the museum. And of course, we don't want to have exhibitions which distract from each other. And we think this is, indeed, my colleagues in the museum think that this is a very important one. And as Hindy indicated, it will be in our large exhibition space. So there are plenty of opportunities for monumental arches of Titus.
Yeah, and it's also it's just very exciting to be able to think across millennia, but also across cultures, and the way and to really think hard about the way in which these different expressions of ancient Israel and Judah are exemplified through these objects and through these texts, and then to offer some comparison. And one thing that really inspired me was hearing Paul Collins talk about the gardens in the I Am Asher Banipal exhibition, and to think about text and object in the second millennium and the first millennium, and now text and object in mosaics. And also to create this space for newer forms of Judaism, which are less, we might call normative. Like, why did so many Jewish homes have amulets and magic bowls? There's one scholar here, Rivka Elitzur Lyman, who has worked on these questions. And how do you put these in conversation with rabbinic literature and early Christian literature, which knows about magic, knows about amulets? So we're hoping to borrow the Ketef Hinnom amulet, for example, from the Israel Museum. The other question, which we haven't really had a chance to talk about today, is about Egypt. And the way in which Egypt can also play a role. We've been in conversation about the Oxyrhynchus papyri and ways in which we can bring some of that material. And Sarah Pierce, who herself is an expert on Philo, and also Meron is here, I saw. I mean, we're drawing on people, and I think on their expertise about Philo of Alexandria, about Josephus, about Elephantini, and beyond. I think one thing to say is that we're presenting this to you today because this is a very big group of people that can help us think together about what will make this efficacious, what will make this a success, how to teach these texts. And we think about it all the time. Many of us are teachers here, we're lecturers, we're professors, where we publish on this. But how can we bring this to the larger public and to celebrate these new findings in a way that help us rewrite history, which is what we're excited about.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions? Oh, there's one. Will the exhibition engage explicitly with rabbinic texts and traditions, and if so, how?
Great. And Paul, perhaps I should take that one. Yes, so absolutely. So Paul made a very quick, we did have to gloss over a lot of things. One of the central pieces is also rabbinic literature, or the centerpiece in some sense is the complexity of rabbinic engagement with halakha, with Jewish law, with hermeneutical traditions, but also with questions around magic and prayer. And what is normative, what is beyond normative. We already have identified texts, manuscripts, both in the Bodleian and in the Cambridge collections, in Cambridge University, as well as in the British Library. What's wonderful about doing this exhibition in the British Museum is we can borrow and share to our heart's delight in this context. And I think I'm not speaking for the British Museum, I'm speaking through Paul Collins, but part of it is this: we have a consortium of museums where we can share objects, fragments, text, scrolls. I can't emphasize enough how important a rabbinic discourse is to this work, both with respect to performance of texts, which is, as well as an ongoing conversation about rethinking what normativity is. And we want to do this with rabbinic texts, not retrospectively imposed on the rabbis or on Second Temple Jewish communities, but to understand more deeply this ongoing convergence or integration across traditions. And we know that the rabbis talk about their engagement with other religious traditions and other cultural traditions. So how to unravel that and how to put the rabbis in conversation with Philo of Alexandria, or these wild piyutim, and also the magic bowls and the amulets that are found with inscriptions that we also know often from rabbinic prayers. One thing, if I can add one more tiny bit, Sarah, is we didn't talk about angels and demons. I only mentioned them very quickly. We're also very interested in the Hechalot material, these ascent literatures, and how to put those in conversation with texts like the Shirot Olat HaShabbat, the angelic texts, and also angelic texts both from the Hellenistic synagogal materials, the Greek materials, as well as our own biblical materials from Tanakh, where there's lots of discussion, different ways of naming prophecy and the revelatory.
Wonderful. You have another question if you're happy to take it. Have you considered displaying Al Yahudu cuneiform tablets, which are housed in a private collection in London, and or the Murashu tablets, which are housed at Penn?
So this is absolutely for Paul.
Yes. Okay.
Well, we have an enormous wish list, for sure. We we put everything on the list. Many objects won't be available for all sorts of reasons. And so again, it's an iterative process as we interrogate every object on the list to see. And clearly not every story can be told in the exhibition context. We have a large space, but our focus will be very much on an audience that on the whole will have very little experience with this material. So all those exciting possibilities that you just heard from Hindy, for example, can be delivered, but not necessarily all in the exhibition space. We have a program of talks, lectures, seminars. So if the tablets themselves, if we choose to focus in on the Babylonian community at that particular time, rather than say the Elephantine community, then obviously we would need to ensure that the objects are available to us. But those are parts of the standard conversations as we build the exhibition. So at this point, we're really sort of laying out the concept, and then the next big job, and again, very keen to hear responses to what we've suggested as the concept, but then it's to actually populate that with stories which can be explained through objects in an exhibition that will be meaningful to as wide an audience as possible.
If I can just add a footnote to Paul's comment, Sarah.
Sure, yes, please.
It's a slightly long footnote, but some of our footnotes are relatively long in books. So there's so many different ways in which we can make this happen. I'll mention two that were inspired by spending time in the British Museum with Paul Collins and his own research, three actually. One is to think about gardens, which I already alluded to. And this is important for anything from the Thanksgiving hymns in the Dead Sea Scrolls to later expressions of gardens in early Kabbalistic materials and the gardens that are represented on the Assyrian reliefs. So to talk about shared images, shared histories. Another is journey, and we played a little bit with talking about different ways in which Jewish community journeyed and journey literature. For example, Idrimi, which we have in the British Museum. So there are many, many different ways in which we can tell the story across millennia. We're not sure exactly which part will find its way. A third thing that's very exciting to me and to Paul is to think about libraries and collections. Qumran is not a library. It's been called a library, but it's this extraordinary cache of scrolls and fragments in a variety of caves. How do we think about library and collection and preservation in the context of the libraries from the Assyrian kings and later libraries, the so-called Alexandrian library? And there's already this extraordinary installation in the British Museum. And this inspired some of our students when we had an opportunity just a few months ago to ask, can we talk about library and collection and books and copy and writing, and drawing parallels to the way in which the scribes talk about themselves, in biblical texts and in Qumran, and then also later, someone asked earlier about the rabbinic materials, the role of the scribe and the role of the chachamim, of the wise men, as kind of new leadership, and how does that transform the way we think about Judaism? So it's both about connective tissue, if you will, continuity, but also really important interruptions, which can be violent, but they can also be innovative, right? Some of the ruptures are about destruction and recovery. Other ruptures are about new culture that challenges us. For example, Islamic interaction with Judaism to think grammatically, or challenges about how to define monotheism, right? This is a very late development, and nevertheless, it becomes very essential to the way in which we want to present this narrative. We can't do everything. We hope to be able to do more in our catalog, and hopefully a volume which represents a series of papers that is inspired by the exhibition. The other thing we're going to do, and some of you who are in this group teach in the UK or in Europe, we will also have opportunities to teach. We want it to be a teaching exhibit. We want people to come and learn from the experience, young and old. And we've already started working with Paul Collins has already been working with his team. There's an education team. There's actually an interpretation department thinking about how to translate some of what we did today into an exhibition that can have large impact, but also impact for visitors of all ages. And we're trying very hard to learn from exhibitions around the world in order to implement the best possible thing we can. And I guess the last point is that we've already had invitations from museums around the world to bring our exhibit there, which is so exciting. My response is let's do it here first. But it's exciting. Paul, you were going to say something, I think.
Only really from what you've just said, it's clear, of course, we could fill the entire exhibition program at the British Museum for many years. So we have to distill it down to these key elements. But yeah, it's hugely exciting possibilities, I think.
Absolutely. And an example of that, you have a question in the chat. Might we have another talk, please, before the exhibition? So nearer the time would be wonderful. Paul Hindy, on behalf of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society and on behalf of all of us here, enormous thanks to you for a really, really wonderful lecture, for your enthusiasm, which is so infectious, and your world-leading expertise that you've displayed to us in such a wonderfully accessible way. We really can't wait for the exhibition. It's really, really exciting, and I'm sure that it's going to really transform the way we think about the ancient Jewish world and its neighbors. So thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.